and then they're going to go to us.
You were born in the US?
I was born in Seoul, Korea.
In Seoul, Korea.
Yes. Hello, everyone on Facebook. I'm delighted you're joining us. I'm Juju Chang with ABC News Nightline, and I'm honored to be here with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you and with everybody on Facebook.
The pleasure is mine. I understand this is your first Facebook Live.
Yes, it is.
And it's also your first United Nations General Assembly as Secretary General.
It is also true.
Right. And as everyone out there no doubt knows, the UNGA is the week when New York becomes total gridlock, when the world's diplomats and heads of state and royalty descend on New York to hash out the world's problems. So we thought we'd ask you for a preview of your agenda for UNGA.
Well, the General Assembly, as you mentioned, this week of the General Assembly is the moment in which heads of state and government from all the countries of the world, we will have 123, plus, of course, ministers from other countries, will have the chance to talk together in the plenary, but especially in the bilateral meetings and in different side events of different formats on Libya, on Central African Republic, on Syria, on all the crucial problems that we have in the world. It's a fantastic opportunity for them to come together. Now, we see so many conflicts in the world that it is vital to bring the parties to the conflict and those countries influencing them to understand that nobody is winning in these wars, that we need to stop them, that people need to come together with this deep feeling that whatever separates them is much less than huge risk for all of us of this multiplication of conflicts, all interrelated and all related to now the global threat of terrorism. So this is an opportunity to bring people together, to force them to discuss and to try to see if in some of these areas we can have a breakthrough.
It's not just your first UNGA, it's also President Donald Trump's first appearance here at the UNGA. I'm wondering, he's been critical about the UN in the past. There have obviously been threats to cut budget. What's your message to him?
Well, we have engaged very strongly with the United States, and you will be here tomorrow supporting our reform program. We need to reform the UN. Many people around the world ask, what is the UN doing? How is it possible that the UN seems sometimes so bureaucratic? How is it that the UN is not more nimble, more effective, more able to respond to the needs and aspirations of the people? So we embarked in a very deep reform process. Reform of our peace and security architecture, reform of our management rules to make it more simple, more nimble, more decentralized, reform of our development system to better support countries in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and in trying to create the conditions for a fair globalization. So all this we are doing, and I think that the American administration has understood that based on this reform process, the UN will not only need but deserve support. So I'm quite enthusiastic about the level of engagement we have had with the American administration and the understanding that I believe is prevailing in the Congress, in the White House, in the State Department, that for the US to support the UN is a good strategy, and a good strategy even for the protection of American interests.
And as you know, the UN here has put out a bunch of questions asking for Facebook questions.
Yes.
They've been stroming in literally thousands of questions, so I want to turn to some of those. The first one is from a gentleman in Colombia, Juan Guillermo Valencia, who wants to ask you, what has been the biggest challenge so far in your capacity as Secretary General? How can you hope to sustain peace in a world full of violence?
Hola, Colombia.
Hola.
Espero poder contestar la pregunta. The biggest challenge is the lack of peace. The biggest challenge is this multiplication of conflicts and the fact that many people still think they can win these wars. But if you look at the wars that we have today in the world, nobody's winning them. When I was in school, looking at history, there was the War of X, and there was always a winner or a coalition of winners. Now, everybody is losing. And so to convince people to stop fighting because they are all losing, it's my biggest challenge, and it's not easy.
I know one of the tone that you've set for your term is about preventing this kind of conflict.
Yes. I mean, we spend 70% of our budget in peacekeeping operations. And they are very important. They are rescuing people everywhere. They are protecting people that could be killed, the regions could be devastated, communities could be broken. And in some situations, there is no peace to keep. So the peacekeepers themselves are attacked. And we have lots of our soldiers, men and women, police, the men and women that have been killed. But, we need to be able to do much more to avoid these situations. Mm-hmm. And so we are engaged in a number of actions. First, development is a key tool for prevention. Second, mediation. I've just created a high-level panel of mediation with very important personalities around the world to help me go to places and try to bring the parties together to avoid the conflict to erupt. Human rights, respect for human rights. It's a very important aspect of prevention. So we are investing as much as we can in all those areas, and at the same time in contacting, whenever there is a crisis emerging, contacting the parties, contacting the communities, asking religious leaders, political leaders, community leaders to be able to come together to speak against this hatred speech that is now emerging in so many parts of the world. So all these actions are now a priority, and what we'll try is to see if in 10 years' time, instead of spending 70% of our budget in peacekeeping, we can spend 70% of our budget in development, in human rights protection, and only 20 or 30% in peacekeeping. But there is a long way to go.
That's a long list of to-dos. There's been urgent action in the Security Council on the issue of North Korea and tensions in the Korean Peninsula. There's a question from Matthias Leal from Brazil, from Sao Paulo, who asks, regarding North Korea, should more aggressive measures, economically speaking, be considered? For example, an economic embargo from China.
Olá, Mateus, é prazer falar em português. Well, I think it is clear that North Korea is violating all international laws. North Korea is doing these tests that are a provocation. Nuclear tests. There's no way we can accept nuclear bombs or the proliferation of nuclear bombs. Missile tests, this is a threat to all the neighbors. So these must stop. And it's very important that the Security Council comes together and is able to maintain its unity, to do everything possible to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. But having said so, it's also important to use this unity of the Security Council as an opportunity for diplomatic engagement, because a military solution would be catastrophic. We need a diplomatic engagement based on very firm Security Council decisions in order to force North Korea to accept that they need to denuclearize.
Another crisis area is in Myanmar, where a third of the population of Rohingya have been displaced. There's a question from Morocco from someone named Ibnu Al-Walid. I hope I pronounced everyone's names correctly. And that person asks, Rohingyas are being killed in Burma. The massacre has been going on for decades. When is the United Nations going to do their duty to stop this and protect the rights of ethnic minorities?
Well, shukran for your question. We have tried to do a lot. I myself, as High Commissioner for Refugees, visited Rakhine State 3 times, I think. Went to the north, to the most dramatic areas where we are seeing now all these problems arising. And indeed, I could witness that the Rohingyas were the most discriminated ethnic group probably around the world. And this has created a situation that went on and on and on. And after a certain number of events that are well known, we are now witnessing a terrible massacre, and 400,000 people have to flee the country. Now, I've written, it's the first official letter of the Secretary General to the Security Council since 1989. I wrote to the Security Council asking them, please act on these. And the Security Council met on Myanmar. They issued a statement, which is not yet what I would like, and I know that a number of countries are putting pressure, especially on the military, because obviously we know the military are having a very strong role on these, to make sure that this operation stops. Our objective is to make it stop, to allow for humanitarian aid that now is blocked to be distributed to everybody through the UN and the NGOs. At the same time, to recognize the right of those that fled the country to come back, and to establish, rules for this population. This population is stateless. Mm-hmm. They have no nationality. The Myanmar refuses to recognize them as their citizens. But they have no other place that recognizes them. And so, even based on the Myanmar nationality laws, those that could receive the nationality should receive it, and the others should be considered with a legal status, with the right to move that they have not, with the right to have access to the labor market, with the right to go to school for their children, to access health. They need to be treated as normal people, allowed to have a normal life, and this is something that I believe the international community should put all pressure on Myanmar to do it, of course, before stopping these military operations that are causing so much devastation.
Words are powerful, especially when they come from the Secretary General. You were asked on Wednesday if you agreed with the assessment that this is ethnic cleansing.
I said that when you have 1/3 of the population of one ethnic group that has to flee, it's difficult to find another world. But there is a way to avoid it. And that way is to stop the military operations now and to allow people to have the right to come back. If that happens, we can avoid ethnic cleansing. You mentioned your 10 years as High Commissioner for Refugees. I have a question from a refugee from Burundi in Tanzania. His name is Laurent Nahimana, and he wants to ask you, how can you address the difficulties that we refugees face in host countries as well as in our country of origin? Laurent, bonsoir. J'ai eu une très grande solidarité avec les réfugiés du Burundi et en Tanzanie et dans d'autres endroits. C'est un plaisir de recevoir une question venue de vous. I think it's absolutely essential to increase support to refugees in the world. We have seen borders closing in the developed world. This is not acceptable. Developing countries, poor countries, have been much more generous with refugees than the richest countries in the world. So we need to make sure that we increase the borders being opened in the developed world, that we increase resettlement from the developing to the developed world of refugees that now live in camps, and at the same time that we do everything to prevent the conditions that make refugees forced to flee.
We are being flooded with questions from Facebook right now. We want to encourage you to give us more, but we have one question from Antonio, who wants to know, what are the characteristics of a good diplomat?
Well, some years ago, a former president of Brazil, Tancredo Neves, was asked what are the most important qualities for a politician. And I would say here, diplomat is more or less the same. And his answer was, what are the 10 more important qualities? And he said, I don't know 10, I only know 7. Patience, 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 and patience. Diplomats need to be very patient. They need to be able to convince that the right thing to do has to be done. They need to be able to overcome all those that are blinded by power, by ambition, or by the wish to submit other peoples to their will.
Patience is important when you look at problems in the long term. Let's look towards climate change. There's a question from Argentina, from Lucia.
There we cannot be patient.
Yes, we cannot be patient there. Lucia Rossi wants to know what happens and what should we do after the withdrawal of the U.S. from the global Paris Agreement on climate change? Will it be possible to achieve the objectives of combating climate change without the support of
Buenas tardes, Argentina. Well, the government of the United States decided to leave the Paris Agreement, but that doesn't mean that the United States is leaving climate action. Because we see cities, we see the business community, we see states totally committed to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is not enough. We need to be more ambitious to make sure that we contain the warming that are amplifying all these terrible storms that we see now.
And those stakeholders are exceeding some of those.
What we believe is that, first, it's very important, no other state has followed. All countries, China, the Europeans, India, they are They still are committed to the Paris Agreement. But more than that, we see in the American society, cities, we see businesses, even in the oil and gas industry, we see states that are totally committed to make the objectives of the United States being met. And this is very reassuring to us.
I have a question on there. Litsa Kapsalis from Greece is just asking, just now, what advice do you have for the youth who are passionate about international relations and diplomacy?
Well, first of all, if you are Greek, you should try to engage with your own country, with your own civil society, with your own government in order to influence things. But on the other hand, you should prepare yourself and be a candidate to your Ministry of Foreign Affairs or to whatever other area in which Greece is present in international relations, and to make sure that you become a very active Greek diplomat in the future.
Lovely. And a question on gender equality, which I think is relevant here. From Turkey, Deniz Ertan. Mr. Secretary General, how can we even dream of achieving gender equality when there are still so many laws and cultural practices that oppress women?
It's true. It's true. Here in the UN, we now have a clear objective of gender parity. Now, I have appointed at the highest level of the organization 17 women and 15 men, and I'm going to do it across the board. We hope that in the end of my mandate we'll have full parity at the top layer, and in 2028 full parity everywhere. But in many countries we still have laws that discriminate against women. We still have situations where women cannot pass the nationality to their children. We still have heritage laws that discriminate between women and children. And this is something that both women, girls, men and boys need to fight against. You need to engage in your civil society, to engage with your members of parliament, to engage with your governments, with your political parties, to make sure that these things change.
Why is parity, gender parity, in your initiative so important in leadership?
For a very simple reason. There is a power problem in the gender relations. No? I mean, we still live in a male-dominated world, and in a male-dominated UN, and in male-dominated governments around the world. And in my opinion, the only way for these to be moved, of course there are many things that need to be done, but the only way is to guarantee that women and men will be present in equal numbers at top decision-making bodies. That is the only way where we can be sure that this power relation can be reversed. Power
sharing. Let's go to a personal question from Natalia Egorova from Latvia, from the city of Riga. She wants to know, how does the responsibility of being UN Secretary General affect your personal life?
Well, I mean, my family is in Lisbon. I'm in New York.
That's a tough commute.
My wife has a very active career. She's deputy mayor of Lisbon for culture, and I think she's doing a fantastic job. And I would never think that I should try to make her come to New York and not to do the fantastic things she's doing in Lisbon. Of course, it's not nice. We see each other twice a month. She comes once a month. I go once a month. So you see, my life is affected. But I mean, that's exactly how it is. I mean, this is a very important commitment. I lived 10 years as High Commissioner for Refugees, the drama of the refugees. We were helping them as much as we could, but it was a huge frustration because we were not able to address the root causes. We were not able to stop the conflicts that generated that movement. And that is why I became a candidate for United Nations Secretary General. I'm not sure if I will be able, but at least I will do everything I can to reduce conflicts in the world. And that justifies a little bit of sacrifice in relation to the family.
We touched on earlier the idea that prevention is such an important initiative for you, preventing conflict, preventing wars. We have a question from Côte d'Ivoire that allows you to get into a little bit deeper, which is from Mezev Dosso. What actions is the UN taking to prevent crisis? How can the UN avoid just being a firefighter of sorts, called in to put out the flames in countries?
Premièrement, bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
But I think I've already answered to a certain extent. Doing development, we are preventing crises. Doing human rights protection, we are preventing crises. Bringing together communities, religious communities, we are preventing crises. But on top of that, we have now a number of specific actions in countries where crises are emerging trying to, in direct contact with the parties, to be able to bring them together, to be able to understand that it's their duty to overcome their differences, it's their duty to be able to establish a normal relationship of respect among them.
Just as an example, draw the lines for me. Why does educating girls, for example, prevent conflict down the road? Why does, looking and expanding human rights prevent conflict down the road?
Many of the conflicts that exist in the world come because of violations of human rights, because communities are discriminated. Communities are completely forgotten in the development process, and that generates anger, and then that helps radicalization, and then that helps violence. Inequality triggers anger. I mean, there are many things we can do, and obviously to have girls educated and to have a society in which gender equality prevails is, I think, a very important tool for peace. Because women have a particular touch in relation to peace, I'm sure.
I think you may be right about that. A question from Indonesia from someone named Yumna Wijdan, who wants to know, how do you handle the pressure of being the head of such a huge organization?
I don't know.
It's been since January.
For the moment, I'm still alive.
No new tricks in your new office?
No tricks. Just do what you think is the right thing to do.
Day to day.
And hope for the best.
Mohammed Hassan from Facebook is wondering, is the current system governing the relationship between states in the Security Council correct, or does the UN need reform?
Of course the UN needs reform. We have a Security Council that's exactly the same as what corresponded to the end of the Second World War, with a small adjustment in the numbers. And obviously that doesn't correspond anymore to what is the world today. But that is probably the most difficult reform. It depends strictly on member states. There is not much I can do on this. But indeed, there is a problem because in many of the crises we have around the world, the Security Council has not been able to come together and address those crises effectively.
We are getting so many questions coming in. We have another one from Armando Brenz, who's asking, what can the UN do to solve the crisis in Venezuela?
Well, we are very strongly supporting the mediation that is taking place. My good friend José Luis Zapatero has been very actively engaged in it. I've been in contact very closely, and we hope that the two parties will be able to come together and come to a political agreement that allows for the country to finally find a way to get out of this crisis that is having a dramatic impact in the economy and in the society.
There's a lot to be done. You have a very long list of things to do. We have another question from Ukraine, from Maria Nosova, who wants to know, how effective or ineffective is the existing mechanism for protecting the rights of refugees? What's preventing states from cooperating more closely?
I think the mechanisms are effective, provided international law is respected. We have very good international refugee law. We have my past organization, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, in which we were trying to make sure that states would abide by them. Unfortunately, in recent times, we have seen more and more countries, especially in the developed world, I'd say, not abiding by not only the international refugee law, but basic rules of compassion and solidarity.
We have so many, literally thousands of questions coming in. We probably have room for about two more, but I'll take this one. Agbalosco Mensa came in on Facebook and asks, the oceans are under immense threat. How is the UN working to clean our oceans for future generations?
Well, the oceans are in danger. And we just had a huge world conference on oceans with a set of principles and a plan of action that was approved. And all of us, we need to convince governments that they need to act, because sometimes, people care about their land, but they forget about the oceans. And part of the oceans, as you know, are not owned by anybody. So the risk of the oceans is very high, and the need for collective action is very strong. And we all, civil societies, must be very strongly pushing governments to make sure that they abide by international law in this regard, and that they do everything for the conservation of oceans and to avoid this dramatic impact that pollution, overfishing, climate change are having on the oceans around the world.
How do you set your priorities on a sort of day-to-day basis?
Difficult to say. As I said, my fundamental priority is peace.
Right.
But then, on a day-to-day, we are running from one area to the other, and we try to do everything we can, because the problems are many, and we cannot forget about development or about climate change or about human rights. We need to be able to do everything And of course, there are difficult choices that we have to make sometimes.
Because you're always juggling the crises, which are on the front burner, versus the long term, which is on the back burner.
That is the problem. I mean, we live in a society that is very much influenced by media and social media. And many times in media and in social media, it's difficult to look deep into root causes. It's difficult to look strategically into the long term. We are very much pushed by whatever happened yesterday or what has happened just 1 hour ago.
Yeah. Well, 30 minutes has gone flying by, so I have one final question from Warsaw, from Poland, from Sonia Sledge, who wants to know, is there one good answer to the question, how can we help? How can I help? How can individuals out there?
Everybody can help. Just be a citizen. Just make sure that you assume your full responsibility as a citizen, which means that you influence your government, that you network with your friends, with your colleagues, with the people that have the same aspirations using Facebook and other tools. Make sure that you put pressure when things are unfair and things are not happening well. If you disagree with laws that are taken place by your parliament or whatever, you should be active in trying to make things change. Be a citizen. Assume your responsibilities. We all can do something.
Secretary General, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all your questions and for joining us for this Facebook Live. Good luck during this UNGA.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.
Fabulous.